There are moments in life when something silently collapses within us. Nothing outside seems different, yet the world is no longer the same. What once made sense loses its meaning. What felt solid reveals its fragility. And a question arises, not one that seeks logic, but truth. Who am I beyond the persona I learned to wear? Carl Gustav Jung called this movement the process of individuation, a symbolic return to the center of the psyche, where the ego encounters the self. Today, we call this movement spiritual awakening, not as an escape from reality, but as a radical immersion into it. Not as instant enlightenment, but as a passage. This is not a comfortable path. It is a psychological death and rebirth, a dialogue between consciousness, shadow, archetypes, and mystery. If you already feel connected to this content, write in the comments, "Awakening," and be part of the change. What Jung called spiritual awakening. Carl Gustav Jung rarely used the expression spiritual awakening, not because he denied its existence, but because he understood the danger of easy words for profound phenomena. For Jung, awakening was not an elevated state of consciousness, but an inner movement of the psyche toward wholeness. He called this process individuation. To individuate does not mean becoming special, enlightened, or superior. It means becoming whole. At the beginning of life, the human being builds a persona, a psychic mask shaped to adapt to the world, culture, family, and expectations. This mask is necessary, but over time, it becomes an invisible prison. Awakening begins when the persona can no longer sustain the inner truth. Something within us starts to call, not with words, but with symptoms: emptiness, nameless anxiety, existential crises, recurring dreams, a sense of disconnection from the familiar world. For Jung, these signs are not illnesses. They are messages from the unconscious. At the center of the psyche, beyond the ego, lies what Jung called the self, the archetype of wholeness, the organizing intelligence of the soul. The ego believes it is the center of consciousness. But awakening occurs when the ego realizes it does not rule alone. This encounter is deeply spiritual, even though Jung described it in psychological language. It is the moment when the individual stops identifying solely with thoughts, roles, and personal stories and begins to sense something greater operating behind ordinary consciousness. Awakening, from this perspective, is not escaping the world, but descending into the depths of one's own soul. Jung observed that when this process is ignored, the psyche becomes ill. When it is welcomed, life gains symbolic meaning. Nothing changes immediately on the outside, but everything changes within. The world remains the same. What changes is the one who observes. And it is at this point that spiritual awakening ceases to be a mystical concept and reveals itself as an inevitable call of the human psyche toward inner truth. Why awakening is not an event, but a process. One of the greatest misconceptions about spiritual awakening is the idea that it happens as a sudden moment of illumination, a single instant, a final revelation, a point of arrival. Jung saw this belief as a trap of the ego. The human psyche does not transform through explosions, but through slow, circular, and deeply symbolic processes. Awakening, for Jung, is not a flash that eliminates darkness, but a continuous learning to walk with it. Consciousness expands in layers. Each insight reveals new conflicts. Each answer generates new questions. For this reason, the process of individuation is never linear. There are advances and regressions. Moments of clarity followed by periods of confusion. Sensations of unity alternating with crises of meaning. Jung observed that many patients believed they had awakened, when, in fact, they had merely touched an unconscious content without integrating it into everyday life. Without integration, awakening becomes inflated. The ego appropriates the experience and creates a new spiritual identity. But the true process does not inflate the ego, it relativizes it. Authentic awakening does not say, "I know more." It whispers, "I realize that I do not know." That is why Jung compared awakening to alchemy, not a mystical trick, but a long work, opus magnum, in which consciousness is slowly refined through confrontation with the shadow, the archetypes, and the paradoxes of existence. Each phase of the process requires time. Time to feel. Time to symbolize. Time to live. When someone tries to skip stages, the psyche reacts. Anxiety, confusion, dissociation, or escape from reality emerge. True awakening does not remove the individual from the world. It returns them to the world more conscious, more responsible, and more human. There is no finish line. There is depth. And perhaps the greatest sign of spiritual maturity is understanding that awakening does not end. It only deepens. The 12 stages of spiritual awakening. A Jungian reading of the journey of the psyche. Jung never officially systematized 12 stages of spiritual awakening. What he did was something deeper. He described universal patterns of transformation of consciousness. These patterns appear repeatedly in dreams, myths, alchemy, psychological crises, and spiritual experiences throughout history. Based on his studies of individuation, archetypes, and symbolism, awakening can be understood as an archetypal journey composed of recurring stages. They are not fixed steps. They are movements of the psyche. They may overlap, return, and deepen. The 12 stages presented here are a symbolic synthesis, inspired by analytical psychology, alchemy, and the myth of the hero's journey, all deeply connected to Jung's work. Stage 1. The unexamined life identification with the persona. The individual lives identified with roles, habits, and external expectations. Consciousness is turned outward. Life is functional but automatic. Here, the ego believes it is the whole. Stage 2. The crisis of meaning. Something breaks. A loss, an emptiness, an inner or outer collapse. The persona begins to fail. Existential questions arise. For Jung, this is the call of the self. Stage 3. The awakening of inner observation. Attention turns inward. The individual begins to observe thoughts, emotions, and patterns. Consciousness separates, for the first time, from total identification with the ego. Stage 4. The encounter with the shadow. Repressed contents emerge, fears, guilt, trauma, denied impulses. This is one of the most uncomfortable and most necessary stages. Nothing spiritual happens without crossing the shadow. Stage 5. The disintegration of the old ego. Old beliefs lose meaning. Identities collapse. The sensation of not knowing who one is appears. For Jung, this is a symbolic death. Stage 6. The dark night of the soul. A deep emptiness. Absence of meaning. Inner silence. It is not ordinary depression. It is an initiatory void. Here, the ego learns not to control. Stage 7. Contact with the deep unconscious. Intense dreams, symbols, intuitions, and synchronicities increase. The psyche begins to communicate symbolically. The unconscious ceases to be an enemy and becomes a guide. Stage 8. The awakening of the self. A sense of wholeness begins to emerge, not as constant ecstasy, but as inner alignment. The ego recognizes that something greater is operating. Stage 9. The integration of opposites. Light and shadow. Reason and intuition. Spiritual and human. Awakening ceases to be conflict and becomes synthesis. Stage 10. The return to the world. Expanded consciousness returns to ordinary life. Work, relationships, and responsibilities continue, but with a new perspective. This is the true test of awakening. Stage 11. Conscious service. The individual begins to express their wholeness in the world. Not through inflated spiritual missions, but through inner coherence. Life becomes an expression of the self. Stage 12. Continuous individuation. There is no end. There is deepening. Awakening does not finish. It matures. Consciousness remains in constant dialogue with the unconscious. The 12 stages of spiritual awakening in daily life. Spiritual awakening does not happen in isolated temples or permanent mystical states. It happens in the midst of ordinary life, at work, in relationships, in silent inner conflicts. Jung insisted, everything that is not lived consciously returns as fate. Thus, each stage of awakening can be perceived through simple, yet profound, signs in daily life. The unexamined life, routine repeats mechanically. Choices feel automatic. A vague sense that something is missing, even when everything seems fine. The crisis of meaning, questions arise spontaneously. Is this all? What am I doing with my life? External changes or inner crises act as triggers. Inner observation, one begins to notice personal patterns. Thoughts are no longer absolute truths. Silence gains value. Encounter with the shadow, intense emotional reactions appear. Old traumas surface. Projections become evident. Many give up here. Disintegration of the old ego, the former identity no longer works. Confusion, insecurity, and the feeling of being between worlds. The dark night of the soul, life loses flavor. No enthusiasm, but also no classic despair. A void that asks for surrender, not explanation. Contact with the deep unconscious, dreams intensify. Intuitions increase. Synchronicities appear. Reality seems to dialogue with the inner world. Awakening of the self, a sense of alignment arises. Not euphoria, but clarity. Being in one's axis. Integration of opposites, contradictions cease to be problems. Light and shadow are accepted. The search for spiritual perfection fades. Return to the world, awakening appears in simple attitudes, clearer boundaries, more authentic choices, real presence. Conscious service, one impacts the world by who they are, not by what they preach. Service happens naturally. Continuous individuation, the process stabilizes as a path. No rush to arrive. Life becomes an ongoing dialogue with the soul. Jung warned, when awakening is not integrated into practical life, it becomes spiritual fantasy. The true sign of awakening is not what one feels internally, but how one lives externally. The dark night of the soul and the encounter with the shadow. No true awakening happens without crossing darkness. Jung stated plainly, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The dark night of the soul is not a mistake on the spiritual path. It is the path. When awakening begins to dismantle old ego structures, what was repressed, denied, or forgotten must emerge. Jung called this content the shadow. The shadow is not only what we consider negative. It includes everything that could not be lived, felt, or accepted. During this stage, the psyche seems to withdraw old supports. Spiritual beliefs lose their shine. Practices once comforting feel empty. A sense of inner abandonment is common. This is not punishment. It is purification of consciousness. The dark night occurs when the ego can no longer sustain illusions, but does not yet trust the self. It is a space between worlds. Jung observed that many people confuse this stage with spiritual failure or regression. In truth, it is a psychological rite of passage. Here, the shadow appears in daily life, disproportionate emotional reactions, old memories surfacing unexpectedly, feelings of inadequacy or guilt, deep questioning of identity and purpose. The mind naturally resists. It avoids feeling. It seeks quick explanations. It spiritualizes pain. But Jung warned, what is avoided in the unconscious returns as conscious suffering. Crossing the shadow requires courage, not to fight it, but to look at it without judgment. When the shadow is integrated, it stops sabotaging. The energy once trapped returns to consciousness. At this point, something silent happens. The ego learns not to be the center. The dark night does not destroy the individual. It destroys only what is not true. And paradoxically, it is there, in the darkest point, that consciousness begins to mature. Why the mind resists spiritual awakening so much? The mind was not created to awaken. It was created to protect, organize, and control. Jung understood the rational mind as an essential tool, but deeply limited when it tries to grasp the mystery of the deep psyche. Spiritual awakening threatens the ego's primary function, maintaining a stable identity. When awakening begins, the ego senses danger, not because something bad is happening, but because something unknown is approaching. The mind operates through categories: right and wrong, self and other, control and predictability. Awakening dissolves these boundaries. Thus, the mind reacts with excessive doubt, fear of going insane, compulsive need to understand everything, search for spiritual labels, resistance to silence. Jung observed that the ego confuses loss of control with annihilation. But awakening does not destroy the mind. It relativizes it. Problems arise when the ego tries to dominate the spiritual process, turning awakening into a concept, status, or identity. At that point, spirituality becomes a psychological defense. The mind wants clear maps, guarantees, and promises. Awakening offers paradoxes, symbols, and uncertainty, and that is precisely what matures consciousness. When the mind can no longer explain, listening begins. Jung stated that the unconscious communicates through symbols because deep truth does not fit literal language. Awakening requires a shift in posture, no longer understanding in order to control, but trusting in order to understand. The mind's resistance is not a mistake. It is a healthy limit that prevents psychic collapse. That is why Jung defended awakening as gradual, integrated into concrete life, and anchored in personal responsibility. When the mind learns to serve rather than govern, awakening ceases to be a threat and becomes inner dialogue. Synchronicity, when the universe responds. Jung noticed something that traditional science could not explain. Yet countless people reported during deep inner transformations external events began to coincide meaningfully with inner psychic states. He called this synchronicity. Synchronicity is not ordinary coincidence. It is the simultaneous occurrence of two or more events that have no direct causal relationship, yet share symbolic meaning for the one experiencing them. During spiritual awakening, synchronicity intensifies because consciousness becomes less fragmented. As the ego loosens control, One perceives patterns where previously there was only chance. Jung believed that, in such moments, the individual psyche resonates with the collective unconscious. Simple examples include thinking of someone and receiving a message from them, finding answers to inner questions in books, conversations, or repeated symbols, dreams that anticipate important emotional events, encounters that change the course of life without logical explanation. These events do not mean that the individual controls the universe. That is an inflated ego interpretation. For Jung, synchronicity points to something subtler, a temporary alignment between consciousness and meaning. During awakening, the world does not become magical. The gaze becomes symbolic. Reality ceases to be purely mechanical and becomes meaningful. Jung warned, however, interpreting everything as a sign can lead to spiritual paranoia. Spiritual maturity lies not in seeing signs everywhere, but in discerning what truly resonates with inner transformation. Synchronicity does not guide life. It confirms processes already underway. Spiritual awakening is not escaping life. One of the greatest dangers on the spiritual path is using spirituality as escape. Jung observed this repeatedly and implicitly called it spiritual ego inflation. When consciousness touches deep unconscious contents, the ego may appropriate the experience and create a new identity. I am awakened, I am conscious, I am different. But true awakening does not distance the individual from life. It brings them closer to it. Spiritual bypassing occurs when one tries to avoid emotional conflicts, deny human responsibilities, ignore unresolved trauma, replace psychological maturity with elevated concepts. Jung was emphatic: there is no spirituality without psychic reality. There is no transcendence that skips the human condition. Authentic awakening does not eliminate difficult emotions. It expands the capacity to feel them without being dominated by them. The awakened person is not light all the time. They are present. Spirituality that rejects the body, the world, and relationships is not liberation. It is dissociation. For this reason, Jung stated that the goal of individuation was not ascent to spirit, but integration of spirit, psyche, and matter. True awakening reveals itself in simple actions: healthier boundaries, more honest relationships, choices aligned with inner truth, responsibility for one's projections. There is no need to abandon the world. There is a need to inhabit it consciously. Mature spirituality does not create distance. It creates rootedness. How to use spiritual awakening consciously. Spiritual awakening is not an end. It is an opening. What defines its maturity is not what was felt, but what is done afterward. Jung stated that every expansion of consciousness demands responsibility. Seeing more implies responding differently. Using awakening consciously means, above all, integration, not accumulating experiences. Integration is the silent work of bringing what was revealed into concrete life. This begins with continuous observation of the ego. The ego does not disappear. It learns its place. When awakening is integrated, the person recognizes emotional triggers, owns projections, stops expecting the world to confirm inner truth, no longer seeks external spiritual validation. Conscious awakening does not require isolation. It requires presence. Jung warned that unintegrated spiritual experiences can generate confusion, anxiety, and even psychic rupture. Thus, awakening must be lived on 3 levels: emotional, mental, relational. Feel without getting lost. Think without controlling. Relate without projecting. Using awakening consciously also means accepting that not everything must be understood now. Some truths require time to mature. Integrated consciousness does not try to save the world. It transforms how the individual participates in it. Awakening ceases to be a search and becomes inner alignment. Why there is so much talk about spiritual awakening today? For Jung, nothing that emerges in the individual is disconnected from the collective. The personal psyche is immersed in the collective unconscious. When a theme appears simultaneously across cultures and contexts, it indicates an archetypal movement underway. The current interest in spiritual awakening is not a trend. It is a symptom. We are witnessing the collapse of old narratives, rigid identities, promises of happiness based solely on consumption, absolute beliefs about success, control, and progress. These structures supported the collective ego for a long time. Today, they no longer answer essential questions. The rise of anxiety, depression, and emptiness is not only a clinical issue. It is a collective psychic signal, a crisis of meaning. When old myths lose power, the psyche seeks new symbols to reorganize itself. Spiritual awakening emerges as an attempt to reconnect with something deeper than social identity. Not because people are more evolved, but because they are more disoriented. Technology accelerated the external world but did not prepare the inner one. Silence became rare. Presence fragmented. Meaning diluted. In this context, awakening appears as a call to return, to interiority, to symbol, to listening to the soul. Jung warned that when the collective unconscious is not recognized, it manifests chaotically. Thus, collective awakening can generate both expansion and spiritual confusion. There is more access to information, but less integration. More elevated discourse, but less rootedness. The true awakening of our time is not escaping modernity, but crossing it consciously. Awakening as responsibility, not privilege. Spiritual awakening does not make anyone special. It makes them responsible. Jung was clear. Every expansion of consciousness carries ethical weight. Seeing more requires acting with greater care, clarity, and inner honesty. When awakening is mistaken for privilege, the ego finds a new way to inflate. A sense of being above, beyond, or more conscious than others arises. This is one of the clearest signs that the process has stalled. Mature awakening does not create separation. It creates lucid compassion, not naive compassion, but one that recognizes pain, limits, and human shadows. For Jung, integrating the self means owning one's shadow without projecting it onto the world. This changes how the individual stands in life. Less judgment, more emotional responsibility, less need to convince, greater coherence between thought, word, and action. The awakened person does not need to prove anything. They live. True awakening is not announced. It manifests in how one handles power, silence, conflict, and vulnerability. Expanded consciousness does not ask for followers. It asks for ethical presence in the world. The return to the world, true awakening. Every authentic awakening ends where it began, in ordinary life. Jung observed that the greatest mistake on the spiritual path is confusing expansion of consciousness with withdrawal from the world. The process of individuation does not remove the individual from reality. It returns them to it more whole. After crossing the shadow, the collapse of old identities, and contact with the self, there is a quiet return. Nothing external needs to change dramatically. What changes is the way of being. The individual returns to work, relationships, and responsibilities, now with presence. The world ceases to be an enemy or an escape and becomes a field of expression for inner wholeness. The truly awakened do not live in permanent ecstasy. They live in coherence. They recognize that light does not exist without shadow, spirit does not separate from the body, inner silence can coexist with the noise of the world. Jung said the self wants to be lived, not admired from afar. Mature awakening reveals itself in simple gestures, true listening, clear boundaries, aligned choices, acceptance of one's humanity. There is no need to proclaim consciousness. It shows itself in how one lives. The return to the world is the highest point of awakening because it demands what is rarest, integrating mystery into everyday life. And thus, awakening ceases to be a spiritual search and becomes a way of existing. If this message resonates with you, it is not because you have arrived, but because the journey has already begun. Awakening does not separate you from life. It makes you belong to it, fully, consciously, and responsibly.